Africans and Europeans, Part 2. So we left off last time with Anthony Johnson. So the thing is, Anthony Johnson was a black slave who arrived in the Virginia colony in 1621. However, he would go on to get married, he would purchase his and his family's liberty, and then from there he actually owned his own 250-acre plantation, owned slaves in his own right. And in fact, when his plantation burned to the ground, in 1653, local authorities actually granted Johnson relief from paying taxes that year in recognition of his family's hard work and known services in supporting themselves. But these kinds of actions and the fact that Johnson was able to do these things leads us to the question of, was Anthony Johnson a slave, or was he more along the lines of an indentured servant? The thing is, all of this was really possible because basically slavery had not become firmly embedded in many regions, and you can actually argue that it never becomes firmly embedded in regions such as the North, partly because of the expensive slaves for any farmers. Though I should mention that even in the North, you do get some large farmers requiring significant numbers of slaves, and oftentimes you find slaves in like cities and as domestic servants and everything like that. But really, early in this time period, when we're looking at like the 1600s especially, slavery is just not firmly embedded anywhere necessarily in the North American continent. This is going to be different though from the South, because over time slavery does become much more firmly embedded and it becomes the dominant system of labor. And in fact, generations of later slaves are going to face much harsher conditions because basically those people who are in charge don't want free black people around because it might start to give their slaves ideas about freedom. I mean, even if you look at Anthony Johnson, so Anthony Johnson managed to become a free man. However, when he died in 1670, his son took over his plantation, and yet within a year, the plantation would actually be taken away from him by a jury because in the documents they'd say he was a Negro. That was it. And so thus we see that apparent discrimination against those of color early on. You're also going to start seeing slave codes at this time that really codify human beings as property. So when we're looking at slave codes, the thing is, we see here, once again, I should repeat that generations have harsher conditions. They don't want free black people, like I said before. And those actually who were free are going to suffer under increasingly the burden of legal discrimination against them. So things like interracial marriages would be prohibited. So when we're looking at the conditions of slaves becoming worse, this is partly because of slave codes, which codified human beings as property. So some examples of these would be, and this is just looking at the Chesapeake colonies. In 1662, slavery would be defined as a lifelong and inherited status. So it's going to be much harder for Anthony Johnsons of the world. In 1667, they would say that baptism would not release slaves from bondage. And then in 1669, the House of Burgesses actually gave masters power of life and death over their slaves. Now, the thing about slave codes is they are everywhere in like the English colonies. You also see them in other colonies like the Spanish colonies and the French colonies, but they're particularly harsh in the southern English colonies because slavery is going to become the dominant system there. Despite these hardships, we are going to see that African Americans are going to, and I should say Africans and eventually African Americans over time as they have new generations and everything, are going to still form families and their own communities. Now, this community life is really going to be delayed until well into the 18th century, the late 1700s basically, partly because to form a community you need things like sufficient numbers of people. You need these numbers of people to be in specific localities and have regular contact with each other. They need to not just have regular contact with each other, they need to be able to communicate with each other. And so that means that you need like ethnic and language barriers to erode, which occurs over time. And then for families to develop, you have to have adequate numbers of slave women as well as men. And initially, when the African slave trade is coming into the English colonies, there's really a scarcity of women. All of these needs means that it's going to be harder to accomplish slave families and communities, and thus this vibrant society within society, so to speak, in the North. It's going to be harder to do this because a lot of times there'd only be like one or two or in pairs in a master's house mostly. A slave's life generally was structured around work mostly. The majority of them would serve as field hands, but on large plantations, some might be trained in specialities. This would be like they'd be a shoemaker or a weaver or a tailor, and others might even be chosen as drivers or leaders of work gauges. And the thing is, work wasn't necessarily every minute of a slave's life. They are still able to nurture ties of family and community in intervals and around their assigned duties. In this way, they would actually be able to preserve different elements of their African heritage. For instance, there was a great emphasis on like funerals. They might make African-style instruments, have traditional songs and dances. If they were allowed to build their own houses, they might, incorporate different African elements into the designs. If they were allowed to grow their own gardens, they might grow their own different African foods. This is how we get like rice and everything, eventually more so. When it comes to conversion, very few masters actually showed interest in converting their slaves. There are some converts, but really widespread adoption of like Christianity is not going to happen until after the American Revolution, and even then it's still a smaller amount than you might imagine. Still, this community really gave a sense of belonging and dignity to these Africans and eventually African Americans who were facing just incredibly hard lives. And then, of course, there is resistance. Inevitably, when one talks about slavery, you have to talk about how did the slaves resist. The thing is, when a slave tried to rebel in some way, they're not just risking themselves, they're risking their family and friends. That being said, one of the most common forms of resistance was running away. But even at that point, the question is, where do you go then? Some African slaves and then eventually African American slaves would run to like Florida, that is, remember, owned by Spain at this time. Others, though, might try to survive on their own in the woods or join like Native Americans. There were also many other forms of protest as well. They might work slowly, break tools, pretend to be ill. And then there's even more direct actions like damage crops, steal goods, set fire to barns or a house or even fields and everything. And then, of course, there were complete rebellions. The thing is, slave rebellions were extremely hard to organize. No slave rebellion ever succeeds in the British colonies. So whenever we talk about any rebellions, know that no slave rebellion is going to succeed in the British colonies. We're actually only going to see one successful slave rebellion in this class, and it is not at this time. And it's not in the British colonies. We do see, though, two different slave rebellions during the colonial period. One is in 1712 in New York City, and one is in 1739, that is the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. Both of these would just result in laws that were even stricter about slaves and even more supervision of slave activities. So I ask you this question as a part of your journal today. What does this shift over into slavery and change in slavery show us? What can we learn about the English colonies based off of this change is the idea. So what do we learn about the English colonies when we look at this shift over into slavery from indentured servitude, or even if you're just looking at slavery and how it's changing and how it's becoming the more dominant structure in certain areas of the English colonies? So what do we learn about the English colonies from this?